Okay, I think we'll kick off then. So thank you very much for your attendance today. My name is Richard Catling. I'm a partner in Al-Tamimi and Company. We are a regional law firm with offices in Kuwait as well as around the GCC in the wider Middle East. And I'm joined today by Ola Saab, Head of Corporate Commercial in our Kuwait office, and also Russell Pryor, Managing Director of HSBC Global Private Banking. So the purposes of this session today is really to give an overview of some of the issues and potential solutions around corporate structuring, governance, and generally how best to structure a family business and provide for proper, efficient, robust, legally effective, and commercially astute corporate structuring for family business ownership and generally for private wealth. So if we start the session, just a very quick overview of Al-Tamimi. So as I've mentioned, we're a law firm operating around the Middle East, and we have our family business and private wealth practice, which does exactly as I've suggested and provides advice to family businesses around the region in structuring their private wealth and family business ownership. And there are a number of different aspects to that advice, and we'll touch upon some of the issues that we address and the solutions we provide when we go through the session today. So why is this an issue anyway? Well, there's some obvious key challenges and issues for families in the region. Not all, I would say, a result of their own necessary structure, but a lot of them are to do with some of the sort of inherent and intrinsic issues around legal structures and religious and cultural aspects of family ownership and succession in the region. And as I said, the most prominent issue is exactly that the inheritance laws that operate around the region, including in Kuwait, don't necessarily provide for an easy means of ensuring that succession and ownership of a family business or private wealth can pass from one generation to another without the problems that Sharia inheritance and the fragmentation of ownership as a result of those laws can provide in respect of a business. And that has aspects both of fragmentation of ownership, but also of control. The more people that are interested in a business as the ownership of the business transverses across generations, the more people involved, the more problematic that ownership can be. And so one of the key challenges is addressing how you resolve ownership that starts with a couple of key individuals, i.e. the founder of a business, perhaps second generation, and how that then you transpose that to a wider ownership base as the generations succeed each other. The fact that in the region families tend to be constituted of a large number of members also obviously compounds that issue, because that means that both there is the opportunity for different views and agendas to take root, and not everyone can always be aligned. And ultimately, the more people involved, the more problematic this can be. It's also the case that these families, large families, don't always necessarily have the necessary expertise to properly continue the legacy of the founders who were potentially astute business people. It's not necessarily the case that that business acumen has passed from one generation to another. And obviously, whilst it's important to try and inculcate in successors the same expertise and experience when it comes to running a business, that's not necessarily easy to do and not always the case. Also, businesses in the region tend to have grown up very quickly over a short period of time, organically in a way, where business owners have seen opportunities. They have quite often leapt on those, and that has meant that there hasn't always been one eye on a proper legal structure or a proper structured business with different aspects of it covered by an appropriate legal structure. Rather, it's the commercial opportunity that comes first, and quite often considering how that opportunity, once commercialized, is then maintained and the legacy continued can often come later. As a result of concentrating ownership in a few hands initially, quite often management and ownership go together, which don't always necessarily dictate and provide for a good structure going forward in the future, when again, ownership is fragmented. As a result, management often becomes the same way as well, and that's obviously not good for good management and good governance going forward. And we'll touch upon aspects of good governance in a good structure later on in the session. Ultimately, there are always going to be additional commercial issues insofar as if a business has grown up in a specific way, that means without necessarily a proper legal structure in place, then aspects of liability are not necessarily warehoused in the right place. Personal guarantees and an inability to properly corporatize the structure from a financing and lending perspective all ultimately result in problems. And the issue with those problems is ultimately they will crystallize and cause significant problems for businesses at the point of time when succession actually arises. And so it's for that exact reason why well-advised businesses in the region would do well to look at a proper succession plan. This is something that in other jurisdictions in the region, but also notably in Kuwait, this is something that I think we feel and we see that business owners are now starting to address more substantively than they perhaps did even as soon as or as recently as the pandemic. I think we've seen a significant uptick in the number of instructions and conversations that we're having with business owners around exactly this issue. Sometimes it's promoted and promulgated by issues of taxation and regulation, but also I think ultimately business owners understand that to ensure that there is an effective transition that doesn't ultimately impact the business negatively, that they do need to think about how to plan for the future. And so there are obviously a number of aspects, as we've set out on this slide, to good succession planning. There's different aspects because it is a pervasive and holistic project ultimately that needs to look at all aspects of the business to ensure that it survives an event such as a new generation taking ownership. You want to ultimately ensure that is done without friction and without dispute, or without the opportunity for disputes to arise. And really that goes to survivability. The business needs to look to see how a transition of wealth can be provided for. And that obviously ultimately is about conversation. It's a conversation between the current ownership and the future owners, and how by bringing them into the conversation and helping them understand what and how the business operates and how to ensure that it continues to operate in the right way, that ultimately is the starting point for any succession plan. But it does also give the opportunity to look at different aspects of legal structuring as well. For example, to ensure that there's proper consolidation. Quite often businesses that aren't properly structured will have multiple points of ownership. So, for example, sister companies or affiliated entities that aren't necessarily consolidated under one holding structure. Implementing a holding structure on top of a business doesn't have to be a complicated exercise, but it is really the key, because if there is one point of ownership, then there is also one point where ultimately the nexus between the family and the business coexists, and it's there that proper management and proper governance and proper ownership can be inculcated, both through a legal structure, but also through appropriate documentation and arrangements in the form of shareholder agreements and family constitutions and other such documents. By also structuring at the holding company level, you can also look at the ability to insulate the assets themselves from predations of issues such as liability, and to ensure that dispute processes and inheritance processes are in effect separated and firewalled from the business itself. And we can go on to talk about how that can be done in a little while. I've mentioned that the ability to document these arrangements. It is possible with certain structurings to provide for the family's intention in a legally binding manner, and which will also be enforceable on the next generation, which will ensure that good aspects of governance and ownership continue after the passing of the founder. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to ensure, that there's continuation across the business and across the transition of wealth from one generation to another. Finally, in terms of family unity, this is also the opportunity to think about wider and more holistic discussion around how the family can actually interact better. If there's a shared ownership in the business, it also gives the opportunity for the family to come together, potentially in the way of family assemblies, or otherwise really to just think about how the family interacts with the business, which is ultimately and often, you know, the main source of wealth for the family. And finally, you know, the ability to think about the future is also one aspect of a good succession plan. A business might not necessarily survive in the same form going forward, but to have the ability to structure a succession plan to allow for that future flexibility, whether that's in terms of, you know, future growth and development, or perhaps ultimately dispersing assets to owners through sell downs, or even ultimately a future IPO. All of these things are important aspects of future forward planning, which can be provided for in a separate succession plan. So ultimately, how does one go about doing this? Well, as I said, there needs to be an initial conversation, but at the right point of time, once there is consensus with a in a family as to the fact that there does need to be some form of reorganization and succession plan, which doesn't have to be significant, obviously, depending upon the family and depending upon the business and the family assets, that might be a relatively straightforward exercise, or it might be more complicated. But once that conversation has happened and proper advice has been taken, then really the first point of time, the first issue that needs to be addressed is the appropriate corporate structure, because everything really flows from that. If you have a proper legally robust structure with companies in the right place, the right legal entities operating and doing the right sort of thing, then ultimately you're on the path to a successfully robust and efficient structure that will enable you then to take subsequent steps. For example, ensuring that the business assets and the private wealth are ring-fenced, and that there isn't a cross-contamination across both, and that the family's interests, as agreed in any succession plan, are then appropriately recorded, and whether that's in the form of shares or in the form of any sort of beneficial interest through any other private wealth vehicle, which we'll go on to discuss, all of those things can adequately ensure that family members themselves understand their interest and that there's no dispute around who owns what, because it's all been properly provided for, both for the current generation and also successive ones. And ultimately, how you do all of that is, as I said, enter into appropriate legal arrangements to record all of the terms and provisions that you want to embed in your corporate structure. So as I've said, ultimately, this is a dialogue. We often see our clients, and every client is different, but we often see the more successful clients being the ones that are family business owners that do not dictate, but rather ask the right questions and create consensus amongst family members, because ultimately the next generation are going to be the individuals that are going to inherit the business, and any successful succession plan is going to require them to buy into it and really to have understood the vision of the founder, and for the founder to have understood that that vision needs to be comprehensive and inclusive, in that it must also talk to the aspirations of the next generation. And so there's a question around a discussion of values, and also how those values are going to be carried forward. But also there is the opportunity in any succession plan to think about how the family legacy is going to be continued. And that might mean, for example, that only name bearers should be the subsequent inheritors of the business, or maybe the interest is only supposed to flow down the bloodline. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically Sharia inheritance rules that dictate who ultimately owns the business, because there are ways of ensuring that in a Sharia compliant manner, a legal structure exists that will provide for the founder's intentions in terms of who ultimately should end up inheriting and continuing the ownership of the business. Outside of the intrinsic and actual ownership legally in the business itself, there are other opportunities to think about a wider structuring and aspects of family ownership. And as I said, that can also talk to philanthropy, ventures for new next generation, and also often the ability to establish a family office structure as well for the general benefit of the family when it comes to the private wealth. Ultimately, the important point is once this discussion has been taken, then how is that decision actually going to be arrived at? And really, again, consensus is key here, because the alternative is for a dictatorial approach. Ultimately, if you don't bring everybody with you, the likelihood is that there will be disputes down the line. But in any succession planning, as I said here at the bottom of the slide, there is always the opportunity for disputes as new people come in, new inheritors come in to own the business. And in that sense, it's also equally important that there is proper dispute resolution included in any succession plan. So just to sort of illustrate my point earlier around the fact that companies in the region have grown up very quickly and ultimately and often that means that the general corporate structure isn't particularly well provided for. Here is, a good example of maybe a very basic but quite common ownership structure of a family business, where most families will have interests in different activities. Quite often there will be some form of commercial, industrial, manufacturing, or a distribution type business which operates in different jurisdictions through separate branches. But equally, it's quite often the case that families will have some interest in real estate. That's very common in the region. And so potentially there'll be an ownership in separate real estate assets, which are often ones that provide an income through commercial rent. But equally also through residential properties as well. In addition, it's quite often the case that families will be participants in joint ventures with other third parties, whether that's foreign businesses or other domestic partners. And all of that means that ultimately there can be a number of different corporate entities in any one group. Often it's the case that those businesses are not even set up as limited liability companies, but acting as sole establishments, which, for the lifetime of the founder has worked particularly perfectly well and has enabled him to be flexible and agile and set up businesses quickly, but ultimately means that there's not a proper firewall between the ultimate liability of the founder and the underlying businesses. Also, it's quite often the case that residential hotel operations can be included in the same part of the corporate group as maybe a corporate JV or a manufacturing business. And quite often they're cross-collateralized and security can be taken in one part of the business for other aspects of the wider group, which ultimately means that there's the possibility for issues in one business to have direct impacts on the ability to continue to own and properly hold other aspects of the family's asset base, i.e. the hotel or real estate asset. So an obvious place to start would be, as I said, to think about the ultimate holding structure. And so here's just an example of a relatively better structured ownership arrangement where the ultimate company and the operations are held under a topco or a holding company, where a board of directors sits, which is directly responsible for supervising different aspects of the business, which are all separately segregated in sub-holding companies, which then underneath hold the actual operating companies themselves. All of this is then held through a limited liability structure, which enables proper corporatization of securitization of the business and itself in terms of any bank lending, and also creates clear firewalls in terms of limited liability between, for example, a property business and a manufacturing business. And then on top of the holding company, in this example, we've provided for separate SPVs, special purpose vehicles, to represent the individual stakes of different family branches. So here there's one, what would be one overarching shareholder agreement or family constitution or other legally binding document, which would be entered into by the three shareholding SPVs. And that would mean, therefore, that there's a commonality of ownership and a legally binding arrangement between the three in the holding company itself. And also, in addition, the SPVs segregate the family members themselves from the holding company. So any changes in the family, obviously through inheritance or any other exit mechanism that you include in the constitutional documents, the company itself, the holding company, is insulated from the sort of coming and goings and the transfer in and transfer out family members, all of which happen at the level of each branch of the family's individual SPV. So just to touch upon the fact that whilst not widely understood in Kuwait, the Kuwaiti law does allow for any GCC company to own interests in Kuwaiti businesses. We'll touch upon some specific regulations when Ola discusses those in a little while. But basically what this does mean is that over and above your standard WLL in Kuwait, you also have the ability as a Kuwaiti family with ultimate Kuwaiti ownership to think about some of the aspects that some of the overseas in the GCC structuring options that are commonly used in other parts of the GCC could apply to your average family-owned Kuwaiti business. And specifically here, we're talking about the benefit that the DIFC and ADGM, so that's the Dubai International Financial Center and Abu Dhabi Global Market, can play in your sort of best-in-class sophisticated trust structure, ownership structure. And the reason why those financial free zones are regularly used across the GCC is that the ability to structure ownership through common law trusts, foundations, and common law companies regulations create a very significant amount of flexibility, which is absolutely key when thinking about how a family may or may not want to regularize their own affairs, because every family is different. Every family has particular nuances and aspects of governance and ownership that they may want to institute in their own family business. And oftentimes it's the case that the standard corporate laws around the region do not allow for that necessary flexibility. This is something that, for example, in the UAE, the government is very much aware of, hence the recent introduction of the family company law, which is the Ministry of Economy in the UAE's attempt to try and introduce additional flexibility into the corporate laws available in the UAE. Those similar flexibilities don't exist currently in Kuwait, but regardless of that, there are already the potential to use trusts and foundations in structuring to ensure that some of the issues that you may or may not want to address in a family business can be done so through a very flexible means in these free zones. So just to sort of illustrate that, here is a DIFC trust structure. The benefit of a trust, without going into too much detail in this session as to exactly how a trust works, the benefit of a structure like this, though, is that it enables a separation of legal and beneficial ownership of an underlying asset base, which in this case can be a business. And the ultimate, benefit of that separation is that it's possible to ensure that the legal ownership of a company is maintained in a robust and non-changing permanent structure, but that the beneficial interest in the business can then be held via that beneficial interest that the trust creates for the benefit of family members who can then come and go over time. And the exit and entry of family members over successive generations then has no bearing on the legal ownership of the company, which will continue to be held through that legally robust structure. So here, just to clarify, the trust company, the blue box, acting as a private trust company, it would declare a trust over an underlying DIFC holding company that would in turn own the assets of the business in Kuwait. And the trust over the shares in the holding company would be held on trust for the benefit of beneficiaries. And as I said, that would enable those beneficial interests to transfer from one family member to another over time without the legal ownership in the shares in the structure ever changing. Another very commonplace private wealth structure that's being utilized across the GCC through the financial free zones that I've mentioned as the foundation. This operates very similarly to a trust, the only difference here being that a foundation is a legal entity that doesn't have shareholders, but that it is able to act in a similar way as a trustee would of a trust and pass the interested recipients, or as they're known under the law, or beneficiaries, the benefit, again, of underlying assets. So this is sort of the way to explain it and think about it is an orphan entity which can sit at the top of a corporate structure and allow for, again, that permanence of ownership, because as there are no shareholders, there's no, if the founder passes away or if the second generation succeeds to ownership, what they actually succeed to ownership in is the interest that the foundation provides for, as opposed to a legal shareholding, which would have to be physically or administratively transferred in a holding company at the top of the structure. Now, ultimately, the benefit of all of these structures, as I said, is to ensure that a robust and continuing structure with permanence can exist for the long term and does not rely on individual family members to continue to act appropriately in order for the business to survive. And what this means, therefore, is that the management of the business can be separated out from ownership, and the management would then be recorded, the principal terms of how management would continue be recorded in the form of eligibility criteria and other aspects of governance that Russell will go on to talk about in a little while. But before Russell does, I'm going to pass over to Ola, who's just going to talk around some of the specific aspects of corporate restructuring in a family business in Kuwait, which are unique to the Kuwaiti market. So Ola, if I could just ask you to address those issues now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So basically, in continuation to what Richard said, we have to take into consideration the local laws and regulations, especially when it comes to the assets in Kuwait and the businesses which are set in Kuwait. We have noticed in the past years, there have been a lot of disputes and a lot of downgrade when it comes to the businesses after the founder passes away. And the reason behind that is because of those families did not have in place good succession plans for the family. And therefore, this led to disputes among the family members and the heirs. And of course, when this happens, this will lead to the business being not solid as it was before during the founder's time. Now, some of the families, the big families in Kuwait, I would say, are more educated and sophisticated when it comes to succession plans, and they have been doing it for a long time. However, some other families have started to recognize the importance of this very recently, and we have been approached by several of those families because of Tamimi's expertise in this field in specific. And therefore, we had this webinar today in order for us to go through this, generally speaking, and to introduce our capabilities when it comes to this. So from what Richard said, UAE right now, and with the changes of the laws in the UAE, with the trusts and the foundations, right now it gives options to the families to try to structure their succession plans through the UAE instead of any overseas structuring. It's much easier, and it also allows for those structuring to be more solid, taking into considerations that the GCC treaties. So what does that mean? If a company is established in the UAE and that company is 100% UAE owned or GCC owned, doesn't matter, that company can own 100% branch in Kuwait. So this will allow full ownership. This makes it easier as well to own the structure in Kuwait fully and to be able to control the structure in Kuwait fully. Even if there's a foreign ownership one way or another, we do have a solution for that, which we call the double layer structure. The double layer structure basically is a structure which would allow us to create more than one level of companies in the UAE. So with an ultimate beneficial owner at the top, in which they are foreign bodies, and then the company that will be able to establish in Kuwait will look as if it is fully UAE owned. Those structures have been tested in Kuwait, and so far we have not we haven't had any issues with those structures in Kuwait so far, whether in front of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry or any other ministry to that extent. Richard, can we go to the other slide, please? So basically, there are two conditions for GCC national and entities to own properties and shares in Kuwait. Number one, the first condition is that the corporate bodies are 100% GCC owned, as we have spoke before. The other condition is that the MOA of the company, which is the Memorandum and Articles of Association of the company, allow it to own property and invest in other companies. And those two conditions can be or are obtainable. They can be done easily in Kuwait. They're not a big issue. The only thing, however, which presents some challenges is residential property, because companies in Kuwait are not allowed as of today to own residential property. However, there are other structures that we advise on, certain agreements to be put in place, certain also financial structures to be put in place in order for us to be able to include the residential property in the succession plan from Kuwait law's perspective. Now, in the event real estate property is transferred to a foreign national, for example, from a Kuwaiti woman to her foreign children, because as you are aware, that Kuwaiti women are not allowed to pass the nationality to their kids if they are married to a foreigner as a result of inheritance. What the law says basically that they can hold that real estate for 1 year maximum. They have the right to dispose of that land in a land or property, whatever it is, during that 1 year. If they are unable to sell it or dispose of it during that one period, then in this case, what would happen is that it will be sold through public auction, and the proceeds of the public auction will go to the foreigner. This is generally speaking. So there are a lot of structures which are complementary to what Richard has said. The succession plan has to be worked in a manner between the UAE team, which are extremely specialized when it comes to succession plans, and then we complement them from the local law perspective in order to include all the assets which are in Kuwait, whether bank accounts, whether shares, whether property, etc. I will pass it right now to Russell due to the time constraints, because we're already 1 hour, half an hour plus. So Russell, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ola, and thanks, Richard, for putting on this call today. And good afternoon, everybody. I'd just like to spend a few moments, if that's okay, just covering some of the elements of governance that can play alongside the sort of structuring that Richard and Ola have talked about. At the heart of governance, though, it's also really important to recognize some of those challenges and pitfalls that Richard mentioned at the beginning. And I think in particular, when it comes to thinking about governance, there are a couple that I'd just like to highlight. The first of them is that fragmentation issue that Richard covered. The second one that flows from the risk of fragmentation is the challenge of effective decision making. And also the other important one is that sense of consensus and building common and shared purpose, because at the end of the day, governance is all about an effective framework for decision making for a family. So if it's built on consensus, that is going to be very, very helpful. If I just then kind of move into the topic of governance, I guess what governance is really doing is trying to balance the interests across these three circles. So business ownership, business management, and then family issues. And this is a kind of a very famous model for thinking about these. And what it enables you to do is to put the people who are involved in the business and the family into these sort of circles to understand the roles they play. So clearly you'll understand who the owners are, who the family members are that aren't owners or aren't in the business, and by the same token, people who are in the business who aren't owners and who aren't necessarily members of the family. But what becomes more important is the overlaps of these circles, and particularly the one in the middle, which is where you might potentially have somebody who is both an owner, family member, and in the business, and trying to understand and delineate between these issues and what the people do in relation to these issues becomes super important. What's also important, though, is to recognize that governance isn't just about the rules that you write down. So whilst working with your legal advisors on the sort of structuring that Richard's talked about, having really sound structuring, and your tax advisors as relevant, governance doesn't just talk about those things. It also talks about the way that people behave. So Richard, if you wouldn't mind just moving on to the next one. That's why then this issue of articulating purpose, vision, and values is so important when it comes to good governance. So understanding and having a clear view across the relevant people from the previous slide and those circles about what the wealth philosophy is, the vision, the values, having a common sense of what the goals and objectives for the wealth and for the family are, the approach and attitudes towards the management of that wealth, and I include in that the management of the business, and finally working out what roles people can and want to play across those different circles. All of that is the foundation work that needs to be put in place before you get on to creating the sort of governance structures that can be built around the legal structures that Richard and Ola have been talking about. So Richard, if you just wouldn't mind flipping on to the next slide. What I've tried to do here is just provide one very, very simplified example, and I've just chosen a foundation one because it's a nice, easy diagram. But the concepts behind this slide work for each of the structures that Richard was talking through, and you will have seen some of the terminology from governance in those slides that Richard was presenting. So effectively, what we're trying to do is to build governance according to the three labels here and the three colors that appear. So ownership governance is, as it says, all about the ownership and how that is controlled and organized. And that will relate to the ownership vehicles right at the top of those structures, whether it's the SPVs and the holdcos, or whether it's a family foundation, or whether it's sort of trust structure. But the way that the ownership interacts with the holdco, which is the sort of in the business layer, is important, and it's typically done through the General Assembly and the powers that are set out in there. Obviously, at the business governance level, that's all about corporate governance, and good standard corporate governance is really important. But working out who from the family is involved in that, how powers of non-family members who are running the businesses or elements of the business, how those are controlled and documented, all of that goes into the business governance. And then finally, on the top right, what we're trying to do here is to recognize that there will be family members, particularly as families grow through the generations. There will be family members who aren't perhaps owners, who aren't perhaps working in the business, but nevertheless have a really important role to play in the wider family, whether that's in terms of bringing up the next generation or just being very keen, interested members of the family. So what typically we do is to try and build in governance elements here, things such as a family assembly or a junior family assembly to build up and get ready the next generation. Then finally, I just thought I'd share with you, because that's been quite a high-level discussion. On the next slide, I just share with you some of the elements that go into family governance in practice. And what I've done here is just to highlight them in those three columns of ownership, family, and business. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but if I just pick a couple that we see as being kind of relevant, and with the families we work with in the region come up quite a lot. So on the right-hand column, the first bullet there, criteria for obtaining a job in the business. I think increasingly families are thinking about, well, what does that mean? How do members of the family, how do we work out how we should get them involved and what that means for them? And all of the other elements here as relates to potentially family members working in the business. How are all of those sorts of things going to be covered off? And I think that becomes, as we go through the generations, increasingly critical. And for new members of the family wanting to join, understanding that there's a framework for that is important. In the middle column there, just on family, picking out a couple there, we talked a little bit about, or Richard talked a bit about, dispute resolution. Those sorts of things can be built in, but also things like communication, how members of the next generation can talk about the family or family affairs, those things can be thought about, because there's a lot of reputational issues and confidentiality needed. So how does that get talked about? How does succession get planned? And I've also talked a little bit about the next gen education. And then just on the left-hand column, again, I won't repeat what Richard said, but I think it's really important to think about how does ownership get transferred, the eligibility issues around how will that be, ownership be passed down through the family over the generations, the sort of structures we've talked about and seen through the diagrams, how do they operate, whether it's through shareholder agreements, share classes, voting rights, all sorts of things there to think through. Exit and extraction mechanisms, hugely important. And also just how do the owners behave together, and what assemblies are there for them, for the powers to be exercised. So a lot goes into building the governance framework, but what's really important is that it sits alongside that robust legal advice that your legal advisors will provide, and as I say, your other advisors as is necessary. Richard, let me hand back to you to take us through for the final part of the.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Russell, I think it's probably worth at this point in time, as you say at the top of this slide, it is important to work out to what extent these very well considered and contemplated arrangements in terms of governance and that are pervasive, as you say on your slide. You've covered so many different aspects of how a business and family can think about how to set themselves up for the future. But the important thing to think about ultimately is how much of this and what are the pertinent points that you do want to embed in a legal agreement, and which ones that can be more advisory in nature. That the benefit of some of the flexible ownership structures that we've touched upon very briefly in this, which ultimately is a very high level overview of legal structuring and governance. The benefit of some of those flexible arrangements is that there is a lot of additional ability to put some of these concepts in a legally binding form, which wouldn't otherwise have been the case if you were simply, for example, sticking to the commercial companies law in the UAE or the equivalent in Kuwait, for example. The ability to put in place a structure that allows that separation of legal ownership and beneficial ownership is beneficial insofar as I said earlier, it ensures that there's always a permanent legal ownership that will continue across successive generations. But ultimately, what it also allows is that the interests of beneficiaries in that structure can be subject to and contingent upon their embracing, in effect, an alignment with certain key structures and terms which provide for some of these aspects. So for example, you can create a structure with different rights attaching to certain ownership interests, whether that's through shares or interests in trusts or foundations, which can flow to for example, to name bearers or to family members by kinship. And that can therefore create for the family the ability to ensure that the governance and management vests in the bloodline or the name or those who are name bearers of the founder, for example. It's also possible to include in a legally binding form certain exit mechanisms, which mean that to the extent that a family member did want to exit, that rather than having to take the whole structure or the whole family to court to resolve that exit, that there is an easily understood and efficient means of that person exiting, whether that's through preemption or through some form of buyback, such as the share redemption point that Russell's put on the slide here too. And those are some of the intrinsic aspects of ownership, but equally some of the less intrinsic but equally potentially important aspects of family vision, values, and also the ability for eligibility to join the business, for example. They can also be included in a legally binding form, whether that's through a shareholder agreement or in a governance code adopted pursuant to a trust deed. All of these are the benefit of having them in a legally binding format is that ultimately the family knows that their arrangements that they have instituted will continue across successive generations. They don't have to be set in stone. They can obviously be flexible. They can be subject to an ability for the family to amend them as the years pass to ensure that the business is able to weather storms or changes in regulation or legal structures, or just generally how the business is flowing in one particular direction, as family members, are able to ensure that, the ability to follow profit and the ability to look for opportunities, that they're not prohibited from doing that by having an overly rigid regime. And this is all really ultimately what we come back to, is that there needs to be a holistic and well thought out succession plan which touches upon all of these aspects. But the benefit, as I said, of proper legal structuring is that we can then institute them and incorporate them into arrangements which the family can then rely on, both initially whilst the founder isn't alive, but also in the future without the concern and worry around significant disputes. Because in our experience, it's when there is a succession of ownership that issues that for whatever reason have lain latent or not talked about due to the respect owed to a founder or the first generation being in control for whatever reason, when they're not there, that's when often the opportunity for disputes, and we've seen it in many live examples across the region. Those disputes can arise, but quite often in those instances that we've seen, there hasn't been a proper succession plan that's been put in place prior to that transition. And that is the best thing that any family can do. Whilst it can't obviously ensure that there will never be any argument in respect of a family business and the family members that own it, you can certainly mitigate and significantly reduce the opportunity for friction by talking, as I said, amongst the family and putting in place a set of binding arrangements and rules, together with the other aspects of the governance arrangements that are possible to think about, as Russell has discussed over the last few slides. I omitted to say at the beginning that obviously there were an opportunity for anyone to ask questions, but we've come to the end of the session now. So I'll just leave open the opportunity for anyone to ask a question by putting it in the chat. If they do have any issues that we've addressed that they would like to address now, we can certainly take those questions and address them live on this session. But if not, then obviously we will all be available, and you can reach out to any of us to take any queries or questions or discussion points forward, and we'd be very happy to discuss any aspect of the seminar with you going forward. But we'll just wait a minute or two just to see if there are any questions that anyone wants to pose. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the webinar, and thank you all for your attention. Okay, we have one question in the chat. Well, sorry, two questions in the chat. So the first one is, how are legal structures enforced if multiple jurisdictions are covered? I think the ultimate question there is we would not want to have, and it's pretty much impossible to have, an ownership structure that straddles from multiple jurisdictions. But obviously, in other words, you have to choose the location of where ultimately your business is held. But of course, any business can operate across jurisdictions, and most of the large family businesses that we advise do. And the important thing to do is, when you're instituting any sort of family structuring arrangement, is that you look to make sure that the structure that you're imposing over a business is going to work and won't cause any problems in those individual jurisdictions. So, for example, if there was a jurisdiction that had specific UBO requirements, that they are taken into account when instituting any structure such as a trust or foundation. So due diligence and proper structuring go hand in hand. You need to ensure that from a regulatory perspective, any structure that you put in place doesn't create inadvertent issues that you didn't anticipate. The second question is, what is the disadvantage of creating SPVs for each branch of the family? Would it not create divisions within the larger family? In our experience, no, because I think the benefit of an SPV for separate branches is it means exactly that the separate branches can institute and arrange their own affairs. I think one of the key aspects, as I said at the very beginning of the session, of families in the region is that their families are inherently very large. And as a result, it's very difficult to ensure alignment across 30, 40, 50, 60 plus family members. But the opportunity to segregate ownership through branches, which ultimately then mean that you've got fewer parties to any ultimate ownership agreement, such as a shareholder agreement, we see that as a benefit rather than a negative. One further question: has trust foundation structures been used, and how robust has it been? Would creating trust or foundation structures dilute governance, accountability of management? Well, I think there are two questions there. In respect of the wider GCC, absolutely, trusts and foundations are now quite commonplace. I think it's the case that for many decades, families have been very happy using these sorts of structures for their overseas assets. But as regulation has developed, as practice has developed too, it's now more commonplace that the families see the benefit of these types of structures in their domestic ownership, whether that's in the UAE or other countries in the GCC. And we've advised families in Kuwait as well in respect of exactly these same structures. And then the second half of the question: does creating a trust or foundation dilute governance and accountability of management? Well, no, quite the opposite, actually. I would say, and I invite Russell to comment here as well, but a trust or foundation can actually improve governance because, as I said in the session, the ability to have a permanent structure that will survive the entry and exit of family members over the years means that there can be a set of governance rules that can be set up for the long term. Again, subject to amendment, subject for the ability to the family to create governance aspects that can be changed, but that can ensure that management is overseen ultimately by the owners, but that there isn't the sort of internal day-to-day, not wanting to use a negative phrase, but meddling, but the ability to ensure that management are able to get on with their job without the sort of conflict between ownership and management, which is quite often the issue that we see has caused problems in the past. Russell, I don't know if you've got any additional.
Yeah, just very briefly, Richard. I think the delineation point I think is at the heart of this. I think what you're saying is it clarifies. It doesn't have to dilute. It just clarifies, and I think it's equally important that separation between family, business, and ownership, and knowing who's in exactly what role and what that means within the family. I think that's the benefit. It strengthens rather than dilutes, I think.
Thank you. Robert has asked in respect of tax aspects on the structure, and also Mohammed has a similar question addressing tax. And you're right that we haven't addressed it in the session today, primarily because these structures are not necessarily tax driven. But one thing that I would certainly say is that in recent years, especially in the UAE now, where we have corporation tax, it's absolutely that reason that does prompt families to think about their structures, because there are issues that if they do not address will ultimately result in an inefficient tax structure. So clearly, when thinking about any sort of ownership structure that changes fundamentally how a business is held and structured, that tax is becoming an important, increasingly important part of any structuring arrangement. And tax structuring is something that we now have to hold as one of the primary aspects of any appropriate structure, and we work very closely with our tax team when we do that. There are obviously differences of approach in terms of taxation across jurisdictions. So again, when a business is operating in a multiplicity of jurisdictions, that is also something that needs to be borne in mind. I think one thing I would say is that in the region, the approach to tax is relatively uniform. Certain countries are sort of ahead of the curve than others in either implementing or actually adopting the tax codes that they put in place. But in terms of sort of withholding tax or inheritance tax, that's not something that we see in the region to the same extent as we do in the Western world, which means ultimately, if the business itself is well structured for tax, then an efficient holding structure that deals with all of the issues of governance and succession that we've been addressing shouldn't necessarily have a negative impact from a tax perspective. And I think that answers those two questions. We don't have any other questions in the chat. So with that in mind, that's really absolutely just under an hour. But I think hopefully that's been a very helpful session for anyone. And as I said earlier, if there are any further questions or any comments that anyone would like to address, we'd be very happy to speak to you in due course. So thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you to Ola. Thank you to Russell for attending and to participating in the structure. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.